40 degrees below zero. That is the temperature of the air rushing across the face of a 24-year-old kid from Massachusetts right now in the summer of 1943. Because the rubber oxygen tube plugged into his mask has just been cut in half by a piece of German steel. He is kneeling in a plexiglass cocoon at the tail of a B-17 flying fortress, 22,000 feet over central Germany. A 20mm cannon shell has just exploded 6 inches from his head. Blood is freezing on his cheek before it can run down his neck. His left machine gun is jammed. His radio is dead. The 9 other men on his airplane have no idea he is hit. In about 30 seconds, he is going to lose consciousness from lack of oxygen. And in those 30 seconds, he is going to shoot down 3 German fighters. His name is Michael Arooth. He is going to survive this mission. He is going to fly 13 more. And when he is finished, he will hold a record no American bomber gunner has broken to this day. But here is what Michael Arooth will never learn. The reason his airplane did not explode in a fireball over Germany that morning, the reason he lived long enough to become a legend, had almost nothing to do with his skill. It had to do with 11 bullets and a man he never met in a factory 1,000 miles away, who quietly decided that some part of this war was going to end differently. Massachusetts, in the years before the war. A young man named Michael Louis Arooth grew up in a quiet corner of New England, the son of a family whose name told a story most Americans in the 1930s could not have told you. Arooth, Armenian, a name that had traveled a long way to end up on a New England census form. What he did before the war, we don't really know. Most enlisted men who eventually flew in the 8th Air Force didn't leave behind memoirs. They left behind service numbers. His was 31128966, a number etched decades later into a distinguished service cross citation that most Americans have never read. He was not, by any account we have, a man who went looking for a fight. He was drafted. He went to gunnery school because that is where the Army Air Forces sent him. He learned to strip and reassemble a Browning .50 caliber machine gun blindfolded, because that is what they taught him to do. In the spring of 1943, they put him on a ship, then on a train, then on a bicycle down a wet country lane in Huntingdonshire, England, and they told him this was home now. The base was called Kimbolton, a cluster of Nissen huts, muddy hardstands, and freezing latrines carved into the English countryside. The 379th Bombardment Group, 4 squadrons. Michael Arooth belonged to the 527th, tail code, a triangle with the letter K. He would learn to look for that mark in the sky because that mark meant home. And home, in the summer of 1943, was becoming a very dangerous place, because the American plan for winning the war in the air was starting to fail. The theory had been simple, elegant, even. A B-17 flying fortress carried 11 .50 caliber machine guns. Hundreds of bombers flying in a tight defensive box would produce so much overlapping fire that no German fighter could survive an attack. The bombers, the doctrine said, would defend themselves. They would fly deep into Germany without fighter escort. They would simply absorb what came and destroy the Nazi war machine from 25,000 feet. The reality was that of the 12,732 B-17s ever built, 4,750 would be shot down, more than 1 in 3. And in the summer of 1943, the men flying those airplanes were the ones discovering one mission at a time, exactly how wrong the theory had been. A navigator in Michael Arooth's own squadron would later write about what it felt like to live inside that failing doctrine. His name was Elmer Bendiner, a journalist before the war, a Jewish American who volunteered to fly against the Third Reich because he understood, in a way many of his crewmates did not yet understand, what would happen to the world if Germany was not stopped. He sat in the navigator's compartment of a B-17 named Tondelayo, 16 feet forward of the tail turret, where Michael Arooth knelt. He kept his notes, and 37 later, in a book called The Fall of Fortresses, Bendiner would set down what he had seen, in a voice most veterans never quite managed. He would call combat a frenzy in which I heaved and sweated, but could not stop, because shamefully my guts loved what my head hated. He had, he confessed, seen dead men washed out of their turrets with a hose. This was the world Michael Arooth had walked into. 10 men in a bomber, 4 engines, 11 machine guns, a number stenciled on the fuselage, 4229896, a name painted in yellow near the nose, Tondelayo, and a single tail gunner wedged into a plexiglass box at the far rear of the aircraft, sitting on his knees, looking backward through the sky at everything the crew could not see. That was where Michael Arooth belonged. And very quickly, someone important began to notice him. The commanding officer of the 379th Bombardment Group was a colonel named Maurice A. Preston, a career officer. A hard man, by every account. Colonels did not have to fly combat missions. Preston flew anyway, and when he flew, he had a habit. Elmer Bendiner wrote about it. Bendiner said, quote, "Mike was the best gunner in the 379th, and when the colonel flew, he commandeered the best gunners and ordered Mike to fly with him." Think about what that sentence actually means. A colonel, a man with more rank, more experience, more information about the war than anyone else on the base, had decided that his own life, on the days he chose to risk it, was worth reaching down through the entire chain of command, past every officer under his authority, to pull one specific enlisted man out of one specific bomber crew and put that man behind the tail guns of his airplane. Not for training, not for observation, for insurance. Because Colonel Preston knew what everyone at Kimballton was starting to know. The bombers were not defending themselves. The doctrine was breaking. And in a war that was killing tail gunners at a rate the Army Air Forces did not like to publish in the newspapers, one thing had become quietly clear. Some tail gunners were better than others, and Michael Arooth, the quiet Armenian-American kid from Massachusetts, was the best one they had. He never seems to have talked about it afterward. He never wrote about it. All we have is Bendiner's line, one sentence buried in a chapter about something else, telling us that a colonel had picked out a shunt and treated him like a good luck charm made of flesh and Browning machine guns. Which brings us to the morning of the 30th of July, 1943. Kimballton Airfield. 4 o'clock in the morning. The briefing hut. The mission board came down and the target was revealed. A city in central Germany called Kassel. The target inside that city. The Fiesler Aircraft Works. The factory that was assembling Focke-Wulf 190 fighters under license. The fighters that were killing American bomber crews. To kill the factory was to kill the fighters, eventually. That was the logic. 186 B-17 Flying Fortresses would fly that morning. 107 P-47 Thunderbolts, fitted with belly tanks, would escort them. On paper, it looked like protection. But there was a problem, and the intelligence officer said it out loud. The P-47s did not have the fuel to reach Kassel. They would fly with the bombers to the German border. They would turn back over a place called Aachen, and from Aachen to the target, and from the target back to Aachen, roughly 400 miles of hostile airspace, over the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The bombers would fly alone. No one in the briefing hut said anything. At the back, in the row where the enlisted gunners sat, Sergeant Michael Arooth listened and did not speak and did not move. Outside, in the pre-dawn cold of an English summer, the ground crews were already loading 50 caliber ammunition belts into a B-17 called Tondelayo. They were also, though nobody at Kimballton knew it yet, loading 11 20mm cannon shells that a stranger, in a factory 1,000 miles to the east, had already decided, weeks earlier, would never explode. The engine started at 6:15 in the morning. 4 Wright R8020 engines on a B-17 do not simply start. They cough. They shake the earth. They send a low tremor through the mud of an English airfield that a man can feel in his boots, in his ribs, in the fillings of his teeth. Michael Arooth climbed into the tail of Tondelayo, the way tail gunners always climbed in, through a small hatch near the rear wheel, on his hands and knees, dragging his flight equipment behind him like a man crawling into a coffin that was about to fly. Once inside, he could not stand up. He could not turn around. He could barely move his shoulders. 2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns on a pivoting mount, aimed backward. A man kneeling behind them on a bicycle seat pad, staring through 6 inches of plexiglass. That was the job. He plugged in his oxygen line. He plugged in his interphone. He tested his guns. 1 short burst, muzzle down, toward the empty English morning. 2 answering coughs of yellow flame. The smell of gun oil and cordite filled the compartment. He was ready. 6:30 in the morning, wheels up. Tondelayo rose off the runway at Kimballton and climbed east into a sky the color of wet steel. It took nearly an hour to assemble the formation over England. Groups of B-17s stacking into what the 8th Air Force called a combat box. High squadron, low squadron, lead squadron, so that every gun could cover every angle. If you were a tail gunner, you learned to read the sky like a language, because if you drifted out of formation, you drifted into death. They crossed the English coast at 8,000 feet. They crossed the North Sea at 15,000. They crossed into occupied Europe at 20,000. At altitude, the temperature outside the airplane was about 30 degrees below zero. In the slipstream past an open waist window, it felt colder. In the waist, the gunners stood at those open windows in electrically heated suits that shorted out constantly and burned patches of skin off the men. In the ball turret, a small man crouched inside a plexiglass sphere hanging from the belly of the bomber, alone, knees pulled up against his chest. In the tail, Michael Arooth knelt behind his guns and watched a sky he could not feel. In air, he could not survive without a rubber tube plugged into his mask. This was the office he went to work in. The escort met them near the coast of occupied Europe. 107 P-47 Thunderbolts, big, brutal, silver airplanes, radial engines howling. They took station above and around the bomber formation like sheepdogs around a herd. But the Thunderbolts had a problem, and everybody in the 8th Air Force knew what it was: fuel. The P-47 was a magnificent airplane and a very thirsty one. It could climb, it could dive, it could kill Messerschmitts. What it could not do, in July of 1943, was fly all the way to Kassel and back. Drop tanks were coming. The P-51 Mustang was coming. In another year, American fighters would follow bombers to Berlin. But that was the future. On the morning of July 30th, 1943, the future had not arrived yet. At Aachen, on the German border, the P-47s waggled their wings. Then they turned around. Michael Arooth, from his position at the tail of Tondelayo, watched them go. 107 silver airplanes banking west, catching the morning sun on their bellies, disappearing back toward home. For a long moment, the sky behind the bomber formation was empty. And then it was not. You never see the fighters first. That is one of the things every surviving bomber crewman will tell you. You never see the fighter. You see a glint, a speck, a small imperfection in the geometry of the sky, and by the time your brain finishes deciding what it is, the imperfection is closing at 400 miles an hour. The lead ship called it out first. 12 o'clock high, fighters. Then the top turret, bandits, 6 o'clock, level. Then the ball turret, bandits. Everywhere. The Luftwaffe had been waiting. Radar stations along the Dutch coast had tracked the formation from the moment it crossed the sea. Fighter squadrons had scrambled from bases across the Reich. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, twin-engine destroyers held in reserve for the moment. The American escort turned back. They came in waves. From the front, they closed head-on at a combined speed of over 500 miles an hour. The Luftwaffe had discovered that a B-17 was weakest from directly in front, and that a fighter attacking head-on gave the bomber gunners less than 3 seconds of firing time. 3 seconds is not enough to shoot down a fighter. It is very much enough for a fighter to shoot down a bomber. The first B-17 in the low group went down almost immediately. Cannon fire opened up the cockpit. The airplane rolled, slowly at first, then violently, and fell out of formation, trailing a long ribbon of black smoke. Elmer Bendiner, at his navigator's station in the nose of Tondelayo, saw it out of the corner of his eye. He did not have time to feel anything. He was writing the time in his log. That was the first bomber. It would not be the last. The fighters swept through the formation and reformed on the far side, climbing back for another pass. Now they came from every angle. 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 10 o'clock high. The combat box that was supposed to protect the bombers was being struck from directions the gunners could barely coordinate. Michael Arooth, in the tail of Tondelayo, opened fire for the first time that morning. His job was 6 o'clock, directly behind, everything the crew could not see. A Focke-Wulf 190 had chosen Tondelayo as its target and was pulling into an attack from dead astern, closing fast, its nose sparkling with cannon flashes. Arooth waited. He waited until the fighter filled his ring sight, waited past the point where most gunners in the 8th Air Force would have panicked and opened fire at extreme range, waited until the FW190 was so close he could see the seam where the yellow paint on engine cowling met the grey of the fuselage. And then he squeezed both triggers at once. The Focke-Wulf simply came apart. The engine cowling shattered. The canopy blew off in a spray of plexiglass. The airplane rolled inverted, on fire from nose to tail, and fell away below Tondelayo. That was kill number 1. Michael Arooth did not celebrate. He did not shout on the interphone. He released the triggers, let his eyes sweep across his firing arc, and looked for the next fighter. They came at Tondelayo from the sides too. And here the story pauses for a moment, because something happened in the waist of the airplane that a lot of retellings get wrong. The two waist gunners on Tondelayo did not die at their guns. A cannon shell, or possibly several, struck the waist compartment during the attack. Oxygen lines were severed, and under hypoxia, in the roar and cold and confusion of an air battle, both of those young men, disoriented and starving for oxygen, went out the waist door. They bailed out. They almost certainly did not know they were doing it. Anoxia does that to a man before it kills him. Both of them survived. Both of them were captured on the ground. Both of them spent the rest of the war as prisoners in German camps. They were listed in the crew record as still living. Their story is the quieter half of what happened to Tondelayo that morning. Michael Arooth heard none of it. He was sealed in his tail compartment, firing again, tracking his second target of the day. Another Bf-109 dropping in from high 6 o'clock. He hit it. Not clean, damage to a wing, a smoke trail. It broke off and dove away, and was later scored as a probable. And then it was Michael Arooth's turn. He never saw the fighter that did it to him. That is the last important thing to understand about the tail turret of a B-17. You can see behind, you can see below. You cannot see above and forward into your own aircraft's blind zone. A fighter coming in from the 7 o'clock high, angling down, could get very close before you knew he was there. The 20mm cannon shell hit the frame of the tail turret just above and to the left of Michael Arooth's head. It exploded. Let us be careful here, because this is the moment the whole story turns on. We are going to say only what the Distinguished Service Cross citation issued under authority of the Act of Congress of July 9, 1918, actually says. Quote, "During the course of these determined attacks, Sergeant Arooth destroyed 3 enemy airplanes and, while firing his guns, was wounded by an exploding cannon shell. His left gun was jammed by enemy fire, his oxygen supply line was broken, and the interphone system was inoperative." End quote. 63 words in a government document describing what would have been, for almost any other man in almost any other tail turret, the last few seconds of his life. He was hit. Where exactly? The citation does not say. What we know is that Michael Arooth was bleeding at 30 below, inside a compartment so small he could not turn his body to look at the wound. One of his 2 guns was dead, not out of ammunition, jammed. In the middle of a running fight, jammed meant gone. He had 1 working weapon. His oxygen line was broken. At 22,000 feet, the human body does not work without supplemental oxygen. The medical term is hypoxia. The symptoms, in order, are these: euphoria, then confusion, then loss of fine motor control, then loss of consciousness, then death. In a healthy man, 30 to 60 seconds. Arooth was not a healthy man anymore. His clock was shorter, maybe half. His interphone was dead. He could not tell the pilot he was hit. He could not hear the calls his crewmates were making about the fighter attacks he could no longer see coordinated for him. He was alone, wounded, suffocating, half-armed, sealed at the tail of an airplane whose crew did not know he was dying. And in his ring sight, the next Messerschmitt was already pulling into position. Any reasonable man in Michael Arooth's situation on the morning of July 30th, 1943, would have reached for the yellow handle to his left marked bail out or slumped against his gun mount and waited for the darkness. Michael Arooth did neither. He fired. We do not know what he was thinking. He never wrote about it, and as far as any historian has ever been able to confirm, he never really spoke about it either. What we know is what the citation tells us. Wounded, jammed, suffocating, cut off, he destroyed 3 enemy aeroplanes. At least one of them, and possibly more, went down after he had already been hit. The citation is clear on the sequence. The shell exploded while he was firing his guns, meaning that this man, half blind with blood, breathing air that would not sustain him, working a single machine gun with a body running out of the biological ability to work it, was still shooting German fighters out of the sky over central Germany. He did not stop when they hit him. He did not stop when the gun jammed. He did not stop when the oxygen went. He did not stop when the radio died. At some point, the top turret gunner realized the tail position had gone quiet on the interphone. That was the signal. When a gunner stopped calling in his sector, something had happened to him. The top turret gunner slid down out of his position and crawled aft, past the radio compartment, past the ball turret, back to the entrance of the tail compartment. He found Michael Arooth still at his gun, still trying to fire. He found him with a severed oxygen line hissing in the compartment, blood freezing on the plexiglass, one Browning silent and one Browning smoking, and he found him seconds from unconsciousness. The top turret gunner clamped a spare oxygen bottle onto Arooth's mask, patched the interphone lead, and dragged him back from the guns. Tondelayo was still in formation, and Tondelayo was still flying on 4 engines through an airspace it had no business surviving, because 11 cannon shells were buried in her fuel tanks, and 11 cannon shells had, somehow, inexplicably, refused to explode. They would not explode all the way back to the coast of Holland. They would not explode over the North Sea. They would not explode over the coast of England, or on the long descent toward Kimbleton, or on the wheels-down landing that afternoon. And nobody yet understood what those 11 shells were. Nobody yet understood what they meant. Nobody yet understood that a stranger in a factory somewhere in the occupied East had already saved Michael Arooth's life before Michael Arooth even knew he needed saving. Kimbleton Airfield. Late afternoon, July 30th, 1943, Tondelayo came home the way damaged bombers always came home. Slow, nose slightly high, one engine running a little rough. She turned off the perimeter track, taxied to her hard stand, and the ground crew was already running before the props had finished spinning down. They saw the holes first. Cannon damage along the fuselage, 20mm punctures in the tail section, in the waist, in the wings, a jagged black gash near the No. 2 engine. They opened the waist door and found the compartment empty. The 2 waist gunners were gone. The oxygen system was ripped open. Their guns still stood at the open windows, unmanned. It would take days, and eventually, the Red Cross, before Kimbleton learned that both men were alive, in German hands, on their way to a prison camp somewhere in the Reich. The medics moved on to the tail. Michael Arooth was conscious. Barely. The top turret gunner had gotten oxygen back into him, quickly enough that the hypoxia had not finished its work. But he was cold, and he had lost blood, and there was a lot of it, dried and refrozen and drying again on his flight jacket, on the plexiglass, on the receiver of the one Browning that had kept firing when the other had gone silent. They brought him out through the tail hatch on a stretcher. His feet came out first, then his hips, then his shoulders, then his face, bandaged now, though the bandages did not entirely cover the shrapnel wounds. And then the medics carried him across the concrete toward the ambulance. He was alive, and he was one of the only men on Tondilayo who yet knew, absolutely, how close he had come to being otherwise. He did not know about the 11 shells. Nobody did. That discovery came the next morning. Bon Fawkes, the pilot, walked out to the hard stand at first light on the 31st of July, 1943, the way pilots often did after a bad mission. To look at his airplane, to touch it, to try to make some kind of quiet peace with the machine that had brought him home. The ground crew was already there. The crew chief had a look on his face that Fawkes had not seen before. Fawkes asked for the shell. That was the whole request. The pilot's souvenir. The near miss you keep on your mantelpiece for the rest of your life. Fawkes had watched a 20mm round go into his fuel tank the day before and had watched his airplane not explode, and he wanted to keep the piece of metal that had failed to kill him. The crew chief did not hand him one shell. The crew chief handed him 11 20mm high-explosive cannon shells pulled from the fuel tanks of Tondilayo by armorers who had at first refused to believe what they were finding. Any one of those shells, functioning normally, would have turned Tondilayo into a fireball at 22,000 feet. Any one of them. And there had been 11. A note on the history here. Bendina, in his memoir, remembered the shells coming from flak from anti-aircraft guns on the ground. That is what he wrote. But 20mm flak could not reach the altitude Tondilayo was flying at that morning. The caliber matches, almost certainly, the MG-151-20 cannon carried by the Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts that Michael Arooth had spent the morning fighting. Bender was doing his best, from a navigator's window, 37 years later. That is what memory does. Bon Fawkes stood on the concrete at Kimbolton, holding a cardboard box that should not have existed, and he did not know what to say. He handed the shells over to the base armaments section for deactivation. Standard procedure. You take the fuses out, you empty the powder, you make each round safe. That is what the British armourers did. They took them apart, one by one, in a workshop somewhere in the English countryside. And inside one of them, they found a piece of paper. It was very small. It had been rolled up tightly, jammed into the space where the explosive charge was supposed to be. The writing on it was in a language nobody at the armament section spoke, so they sent it up the chain of command until it reached someone who could read it. The language was Czech. The message, translated, was 7 words long. This is all we can do for you now. Now, we should be honest about where this story comes from. The only man who wrote it down was Elmer Bendina in his 1980 memoir. There is no independent army report we can point to, no armament record we can cite. It is one man's account of a story his own pilot told him, decades after the fact. Historians treat it carefully, but the shells were real. The mission was real. The bomber came home from Kassel with holes in her fuel tanks and refused to explode. Whatever exactly was on that piece of paper, something in that factory had gone wrong for the Third Reich and gone right for Tondilayo. And if you believe Bendina, and most people who read him do, then somewhere in a munitions plant inside Nazi-occupied Europe, an anonymous Czech, an unarmed prisoner without a rifle or a rank or an army, had waited for a moment when the guards were not looking, and had chosen to sabotage the machine that was killing bomber crews over Germany. Not with a bomb, not with a rifle, with the quiet, patient refusal to do his job correctly. Shell after shell, round after round. 11 times, at least, that we know of. 11 times he had risked being seen. 11 times he had bet his life against the possibility that somewhere, someone, one day, would be alive because of what he had failed to do. And on the morning of July 30th, 1943, 22,000 feet over Kassel, that bet came due. Michael Arooth had shot down 3 German fighters that morning, wounded, blinded by his own blood and dying from a cut oxygen line. His skill was real. His courage was real. His 3 kills that day are still in the record in a Distinguished Service Cross citation. But he came home because a man he never met had decided that even a slave in a Nazi factory had power, had agency, had one small act of resistance available to him, and had used it. That is the part of the story that has to sit with you. Not the kills. The note. Michael Arooth went on flying. Some men, after a mission like Kassel, would have been grounded for weeks. Arooth was back in the air within days. The wound healed. The bandages came off. He climbed back into a tail turret and went to Germany again, and again and again. Colonel Preston kept commandeering him. The kills kept accumulating. By the end of his tour, Michael Louis Arooth of Massachusetts was credited unofficially with 17 enemy aircraft, destroyed over 14 combat missions, a number the men who flew with him always insisted on. The official records kept by historian Roger Freeman in the Mighty Eighth put the confirmed figure at 9. Either count, unofficial, or official, made him one of the most effective enlisted bomber gunners of the entire European air war. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with clusters, the Purple Heart for the wound he took on the 30th of July. As for Tondelayo herself, B-17F, serial number 4229896. She did not survive her tour, but she took no one with her when she went. On September 6, 1943, on the way back from a mission to Stuttgart, she ran out of fuel over the English Channel and had to ditch. Vaughan Fawkes put her down on the water. Every man in the crew, including Michael Arooth in the tail, was pulled alive from the sea by a British air-sea rescue launch out of Dover. Arooth took a head injury in the ditching that would eventually ground him. He flew 3 more missions after recovering, and then he was done. Elmer Bendiner, the navigator, who had been sitting 16 feet in front of Arooth on the morning of July 30th, 1943, went home when his tour was up. He returned to civilian life. He worked as a journalist. He raised a family. And 37 years after the Kassel raid, he sat down and wrote The Fall of Fortresses. It is one of the finest memoirs any American bomber crewman ever wrote, and it is the reason we know any of this. Without Bendiner's book, the note in the shell would be a fragment in a squadron rumor nobody remembered. Without Bendiner's book, Colonel Preston's habit of commandeering Arooth would be a scrap of hearsay in an unpublished squadron history. Without Bendiner's book, Michael Louis Arooth of Massachusetts would be a name on a citation and nothing more. Bendiner spent his post-war years making sure the men who had flown with him would not simply vanish into the great, quiet forgetting that swallowed most of the Second World War. He wrote so that a Czech laborer in a munitions factory would not vanish either. Neither one has, as long as somebody somewhere, still tells this story. Now here is the last thing that has to be said. The old story you sometimes hear, that men like Michael Arooth won the air war by proving the self-defending bomber doctrine could work, is not true. Michael Arooth was one of the greatest bomber gunners in the history of the United States military, and his own skill was not enough. His courage was not enough. His kills were not enough. The doctrine that put him in that tail turret with no fighter escort deep inside Germany was a failed doctrine, and the men who wrote it knew it was a failed doctrine by the end of 1943. What actually saved the American bombing campaign was not the tail gunners. It was the long-range fighter escort, the P-51 Mustang, fitted with drop tanks, flying all the way to Berlin. Arriving in strength in the spring of 1944, Michael Arooth did not change air combat. He survived air combat. He survived it more successfully than almost anyone else in his position ever did. And that is a different, quieter, more truthful kind of greatness than the story a fabricator would tell you. He came home after the war. He kept his uniform on. He continued to serve in the United States Air Force until 1962, quietly, the way men of his generation kept doing the work long after the parades were over. And somewhere in Central Europe, a man whose name we do not know finished out the war one way or another, in a factory, or in a camp, or in an unmarked grave. And he almost certainly never learned that on a summer morning in 1943, 11 shells he had refused to arm had come home safely inside the fuel tanks of an American bomber called Tondelayo, with a wounded tail gunner named Michael Louis Arooth in the back. They saved each other, those two men. They never met. They never spoke. They never knew each other's names. And that is the truest story the Second World War ever produced.